Anathema, the cursed city we call Gotham. Hedonism, individuals who abandon themselves for pleasure. The true self, most acutely defined as the image of God, is defiled, and in turn the entire collective group descends into chaos. Abomination, the dogs who practice magical arts, the sexually immoral, the murderers, the idolaters, and all who practice falsehood. Unholy, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, not lovers of the good, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, disorder, chaos, hell on earth, Gotham City. The law. The cursed city is not ruled by a just king. The ruler of this fallen world, Carmine Falcone, is an archetypal representation of Satan. Every institution of quote-unquote justice in the cursed city is under the command of Falcone, wolves in sheep's clothing. The Pharisees in Christ's time were supposed to be arbiters of justice and truth, judges in a fallen world called to maintain order and peace. Corruption plagued the hearts of those who were supposed to uphold the law, and Christ rebuked them, saying, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, while on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanliness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." Matthew 23:27. Catwoman, the maiden. But a postmodern twist on the archetype forges Selina Kyle into an arbiter of feminism. Looking back to the comics and envisioning the future, considering that Catwoman is a villain, we would reasonably consider this symbolic representation of Jezebel. This view isn't easily rendered from the film alone, but when contemplating the bisexuality of the character in the comics and the anarchy therein, it isn't a long shot. In the film, Selina is seeking vengeance, but in the wrong way. A piece of dialogue between Batman and Selina is reminiscent of a piece of dialogue between Christ and Peter. Judas went to Jesus and said, "Hail, Rabbi," and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you have come for." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back in its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." Matthew 26:49-52. A line that since has been quoted infinitesimally. This same message is portrayed twice in the film. First, when Catwoman is about to kill a corrupt officer who is a murderer, Batman slaps the gun out of her hand and says, "No, we'll get him, but not that way." Followed by, "Cross that line, you'll become just like him. Listen to me. Don't throw your life away." Second, after Falcone attempts to strangle Catwoman, she has an opportunity to kill him. Batman holds the gun down and Catwoman yells, "He has to pay." Batman responds, "You don't have to pay with him. You paid enough." Shortly after, Catwoman releases her hand from the gun, allowing Falcone to live. Now, Falcone shortly after is killed by the Riddler, but in one regard, Catwoman did the right thing in that moment. This in turn brings us to necessarily distinguish between citizens and civil magistrates. If the civil magistrates are corrupt, should the citizen take the law into his own hands? And if so, is murder justified? This seems to be the center of disagreement between Batman and Catwoman. Before we approach this disagreement, one thing should be noted. Catwoman seeks vengeance from a disposition of wrath, hatred, and passion. She is killing in order to steal money from Falcone and also willing to kill to avenge her friend. This will in regards to murder is rooted in a wicked form of hatred, not injustice. Batman, in comparison to Selina, is seen to transcend the idea of vengeance by embodying the suffering servant who lays his life down for his sheep. Instead of vengeance, Batman brings redemption. This sense of morality that permeates the hero of our story is espoused by his willingness to never murder. We cannot forget the fact that not only did Falcone kill Selina's mother, but he also killed Bruce's parents. They both had an opportunity to kill Falcone, but the response is different from each of the characters. Selina wants to kill Falcone, but Bruce wants to turn him into the police. Director Matt Reeves provokes our thoughts in this scene and communicates a true view of justice, while revealing the temptation to cross the line. Batman has conquered the monster within. In Jungian terminology, we can say that Batman has integrated his shadow, brought it into submission, while Selina is still dominated by the shadow within. The monster within Selina has authority over her being. True justice is bound in chains while the dragon breathes chaos into the cosmos, seeking vengeance, but burning everything in its path. Alfred, the archetypal old wise man, or in other words, the spiritual guide. The Gandalf, the Dumbledore. He acts as an arbiter of wisdom and sound judgment. A mentor who impresses upon his mentee a sense of who he is and who he can become. When we first meet Alfred, he is giving Bruce fatherly advice to take a shower and tend to the responsibilities of the Wayne's Corporation. Bruce isn't very receptive. We see a thread of spite when Bruce tells Alfred, "You are not my father." The second time we meet Alfred, Bruce is on his way to a memorial and isn't wearing cufflinks. Alfred takes his own cufflinks off and gives them to Bruce. These cufflinks are seals decorated with the Wayne symbol. Bruce asks, "Are you a Wayne too?" Alfred responds, saying, "Your father gave them to me." The third time we meet Alfred brings us into our next chapter. In the story arc of the hero's journey, the spiritual guide plays a key role in the process of transformation. This process, also called individuation, is based around justice and fear in this film, which makes sense because the Batman is both a symbol of justice and fear. We see this in the beginning of the film as Bruce reads from his journal. Director Matt Reeves reveals us to how criminals respond when they see the bat signal. They are fearful, and they return to their lairs because they know what they are doing is unjust. Therefore, the symbol strikes fear in the unjust, but it is still less than sacred. We step into this hero's journey after the call to adventure, after the supernatural aid of those who trained Batman, and there is many. Instead, we step into the threshold, which Joseph Campbell described as the beginning of transformation. And from thenceforth, we shall examine the hero's journey step by step while taking minor tangents all the way. Threshold, I am vengeance. The threshold carries the velocity of the former stages leading up to it. What does the Batman mean by saying, I am vengeance? The Catwoman later calls Batman Vengeance, as if it's his first name. Vengeance is synonymous with words like avenge and vindicate, defined by Oxford University as punishment inflicted or retribution exacted for an injury or wrong. This urge to avenge is primarily rooted in the fear Batman experienced seeing the death of his parents. The trauma and psychological deterioration received from such an experience accumulates like slime and structures his worldview. This worldview, on one hand, motivates Batman to find the killer and bring vengeance. And on the other hand, this worldview motivates Batman to bring vengeance upon any criminal he finds. Let's not forget the context. The government is so corrupt they couldn't find who killed the Waynes, and practically every crime committed connected to Falcone is allowed. So it makes sense in one respect that Batman seeks to bring justice to the city, but that isn't necessarily it. During the conversation, we find that Batman does what he does in the name of his family. It's as if Bruce saw the death of innocent people like his parents and was driven to eradicate such evil from the city. Or maybe that's all he can do to live with himself. Bruce says, "What I'm doing is my family's legacy. If I can't change things here, if I can't have an effect, then I don't care what happens to me." Bruce's aim to bring vengeance is motivated by desire and passion. It is without self-control. His shadow, in one regard, controls him and as the journey progresses, he slowly brings it into submission. This vengeance that permeates the psyche of Batman is ultimately based in the past. That is the problem in many ways with vengeance. It causes you to live in the past. You cannot move forward in the hero's journey if you make your home in the past. How long is long enough until you come to peace with the past and move forward? Eventually you will become enslaved to the past, and in turn, a slave to vengeance, constantly obsessed over justifying the past. The fear derived from his parents' death still is deeply rooted in his unconscious, making its home in the shadow but manifesting itself consciously in a distorted view of vengeance. It is not until the revelation, when Bruce can properly interpret the moral and existential nature of his parents' death, that he can transcend the past and redeem the now as an individual, which inevitably redeems the collective. If the individual cannot transcend the past and its temptation to bring vengeance, then they will die under the weight of their own consciousness, which is symbolized by being defeated by the dragon. The dragon within must be tamed, that fallen nature brought into submission. In this film, manifest most precisely as vengeance, Batman, Riddler, and his goons, the Catwoman. They all are losing to the dragon. Riddler completely consumed in the past, Catwoman deeply enslaved to vengeance, but Batman by the end of the journey defeats the dragon of the psyche, which we will observe later. Abyss. Death. There is a marking point between the threshold and the abyss called the meeting with the Helper. This marking point occurs during a conversation with Alfred after he was almost killed. They reconcile and contextualize the truth behind Bruce's parents' death. Bruce then opens up about the fear that pervades his heart and being scared that he would lose his last family member. Alfred Pennyworth, although not blood related, their souls are tied like a shaman and a student. Later, when Catwoman is about to murder the corrupt cop, she says to Batman, "Come on, vengeance. Let's go kill that son of a bleep. This creep too. Let's finish this." If you didn't realize, Catwoman is almost like a seducing spirit that whispers in the ear of her possessed to fall into lust. Catwoman is constantly tempting Batman to cross the line and live up to quote-unquote vengeance. This sort of identification seems to be what binds the two characters, in that at the moment they share similar desires and passions. Batman in this scenario and forward is very vocal to the people around him about not killing and telling others it is not the right way. As we step into the final parts of the film, the abyss reveals itself. Abyss. Death. Part 2. The death and rebirth of Batman is represented as death from vengeance and rebirthed as Redeemer. Vengeance says to focus on the past. Redeemer says to save the present in hopes for the future. This contrast is revealed bleakly as one of the radicals identify themselves as quote-unquote vengeance. A slow motion shot is exposed where Batman looks at the radical in his eyes and meditates on those words. He sees what vengeance leads to. He sees the anarchy and chaos that is the inevitable fate of his worldview. He sees what happens when you live in the past. At that very moment, a flood pours into the scene. Chaotic waters have been associated with hell, the depths, the abyss. It is a hellish archetype. As Batman stands up above, in a completely safe position, a flood storms into the stadium below. This motif of up above and below has many interpretations. Earlier in the film, the Riddler said that the billionaire Bruce Wayne was sitting in his tower when the orphanage in the slums was burning. This distinguishing mark between classes can metaphorically be understood at a more spiritual level. Batman lives on high, Mount Olympus per se, the highest levels of heaven maybe. When the Riddler says, quote, "I told you I'd see you in hell," they are standing in Arkham Asylum, a jail for psychopaths. Literally a jail for those individuals who have been defeated by their symbolic dragon and allow parasites to spread throughout the veins of their consciousness. Arkham Asylum is like hell. Bruce Wayne's billion-dollar mansion is like heaven. The Riddler, who practically embodies vengeance, planned everything that Batman might embrace vengeance and watch the city burn, but Batman looks vengeance right in its face and calls it pathological. This event, which leads up to the event we just spoke about with the Radical, is what triggers the actualization of transformation, and Bruce can finally understand redemption as opposed to vengeance. This belief is manifest in his actions. Batman ascends from up above into the chaos down below. But we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Hebrews 2, verse 9. What does he ascended mean except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions? He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. Ephesians 4:9. Batman takes on the symbol of the suffering servant by sacrificing his life to save the people from the chaotic flood. He leaps into the electrical beam, which is a surging voltage, into the water. While clinging onto it, he takes a piece of him, a batarang which lies upon his heart, and uses it to cut down this beacon of death which plunges into the chaotic waters, which symbolizes hell. He has redeemed the people, not avenged them, but saved them in one sense. He falls from the destroyed beacon into the chaotic waters, symbolizing self-sacrifice and the descent into hell. Rebirth. When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." John 8:12. When Batman rises from the abyss, the waters have been calmed. He lights a flare, symbolizing that he is the light in the darkness. In the beginning of the film, he says that he is the shadows, but now in the end, he is the light that exposes the shadows. He finds those who are lost in ruins and pulls them out. First and foremost, the orphan. The archetype of the orphan is used excessively throughout the film, and it is essential to understand in order to fully comprehend the narrative. Batman is an orphan. The Riddler is an orphan. The film starts with the Riddler spying on an orphan. Riddler claims that the Batman was not truly an orphan because he is a billionaire. When Batman saves the orphan, director Matt Reeves communicates to us that the Riddler's perception of Bruce Wayne is false because the quote-unquote billionaire orphan sacrifices his life for the orphans down below. We will speak on the Riddler later, so let's continue speaking of Batman's rebirth and transformation. Batman leads all of those in darkness into the light with a flare. This illustration of them following him is a Christological symbol. Christ sacrificed himself, ascended from the highest place of glory down to the inner parts of the earth. Christ is the light, and those who follow him are in the light. He causes sheep out of the darkness into the light. We see the full transformation of Batman with his last journal excerpt where he says, "I'm starting to see it now. I have had an effect here, but not the one I intended. Vengeance won't change the past, mine or anyone else's. I have to become more. People need hope, to know someone's out there for them." Riddler, Sins of the Fathers. As I've said before, the three main characters are battling this demon called vengeance. Batman transcends vengeance, kills the dragon, skins it, and makes a shield from its scales, which is a metaphorical definition for integrating the shadow. Riddler, on the other hand, in the battle of consciousness, has been defeated by the dragon, resulting in a pathological worldview. Riddler, in one regard, represents the quote-unquote social justice warriors of our day, and director Matt Reeves illustrates the logical implications of such a worldview. Riddler was born in an orphanage that was eventually set on fire. The Waynes promised to help but never came, so Riddler coins the statement, "Sins of the Father." What the statement means is that Batman has inherited the guilt of his father. This sort of worldview has Marxist underpinnings which manifest itself in ideologies that push ideas like retributive justice. Those who have fallen into critical theory ideologies make a fool of themselves. It has gotten to the point in our day where white people who are under pressure from the retributive justice movements are apologizing for their whiteness. meaning that they have accepted the guilt of their ancestors. The truth is, none of these white people were alive during slavery and are not responsible at all for what their ancestors have done. The Black Lives Matter activists and every movement pushing such ideologies claim to be about quote-unquote social justice. But it is really social vengeance. The entire collective is corrupt with vengeance. They are living in the past just like the Riddler, seeking to place the sins of the fathers upon its children. The mere existence of Bruce Wayne makes him guilty, and today the mere existence of a white man makes him guilty for slavery. But Bruce had nothing to do with the sins of his father. He was either not born or a baby. Same with modern day white men. This generation has nothing to do with slavery, but their mere existence makes them guilty for the sins of their fathers. This entire view of vengeance and guilt is, as we see in the film, pathological. The individual is responsible for his own actions. In other words, the individual is only guilty if they themselves commit a crime. What these sorts of movements in our day are doing is identifying people by their collective groups, which then allows them to make all in the collective guilty. If there's a single mother, for example, with many children, and one night her son sneaks out and steals, the son is guilty for the crime, not the collective group, in this case his family. If we inherit guilt from our ancestors, then in one regard we are all guilty, and this obviously is nonsense and a pathological way of identifying people. We must identify people as individuals and judge them based upon their individual actions. If the Riddler was to do this, then he would recognize Bruce as the orphan who had nothing to do with the failures of Thomas Wayne. But instead he views Bruce pathologically through the lens of collectivism, where he is guilty of the sins another individual committed. Conclusion. Matt Reeves as Batman communicates beautiful truths regarding the nature of vengeance and fear. We are taken through the hero's journey and get a front row seat to observe what it looks like to integrate the shadow. As Batman transforms, it is almost as if we are transforming, and Matt Reeves puts forth a strong argument in regards to justice that is very compelling. There is more to the film than expressed here, so I encourage you to watch the film again, seeking to read between the lines. If you have any disagreements, or agreements, or ideas yourself, I'd love to read them in the comment section.